Well, welcome to should be gorgeous November 2nd, and welcome to Itasca Water's Practical Water Wisdom Series. I'm Brian Whittemore, your host for today. Itasca Waters is a nonprofit whose goal is to educate residents in Itasca County about how to keep our water clean for both the environment and the economy. We've been teaming up with like-minded people and organizations for almost 15 years now. And you can read about those projects on our website at itascawaters.org. If any of that is of interest to you, please consider becoming a member or a volunteer to help support programs like this. And we thank our partners shown on the screen for their support in producing this program. Now, here's the format for today's program. Dr. Lesley Knoll will speak for about 30 minutes, and then she'll answer questions from you. To submit a question, you only need to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and type in a brief question. And you can do this at any time, and we will read the questions on your behalf. We will not be using the chat function today. This program is being recorded and will be available for viewing online through our website, itascawaters.org. Also, we value your opinion, so please click on the survey link, which will be on screen at the end of today's program, or complete the survey that will be sent to you by email. And we thank you much for doing that. Okay, today's presenter is Dr. Lesley Knoll. She is an assistant professor at Miami University of Ohio and a freshwater ecologist. Her research focuses broadly on how global change affects freshwater systems. Some of her recent work has focused on warming winters and shows that lakes are biologically active in the winter. Her research has shown that what happens in winter can shape lake dynamics in the summer, and that lakes provide important cultural ecosystem services to people during the winter. Dr. Knoll's topic today is ice formation and melting on lakes, what we know and why it matters. The winter season in Minnesota is beloved by most of you, and for some, lake ice is the draw. The ice season on Minnesota lakes is shorter than it used to be. The story in Minnesota is part of a bigger story, because lakes around the world have experienced similar changes over the past century. And she's finding that with less reliable ice, there is a loss to the cultural, social, and economic benefits of ice-related winter activities in Minnesota and other northern areas. She's also working to understand how warmer winters with less ice cover and increased temperatures affects lake biology in the winter and into the summer. In this talk, she will share the implications of losing lake ice in Minnesota and beyond. With all that being said, Dr. Knoll, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Brian, so much for that introduction. So again, thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to come speak today. I'm going to talk a lot about lake ice, so what we know and why it matters, particularly in the context of how people use lake ice and some of the ways things are changing in the winter times with regard to some of the social uses of lake ice. So you might see my name here and where I'm from. So in Ohio now, wondering why I'm thinking about lake ice being in a more southern state in the US. So I just want to mention before I started here at Miami last year, I spent about 7 years in northern Minnesota working at the Itasca Biological Station, which is part of the University of Minnesota. So I was there as the associate director for about those 7 years. And so I was very intimately acquainted with lake ice during the winter. I saw it outside of my office door or office window every day. My office overlooked Lake Itasca. So a lot of the images I'm going to share today are images that I took while I was up at the field station there. And many of them are also on Lake Itasca. All right, I need to move a couple things. They're in the way. Oops. All right, so we know that lakes across much of the world, including Minnesota, have seasonal ice cover, right? It's very common to have a large chunk of the wintertime with ice cover. So about half of the world's 117 million lakes roughly periodically freeze each winter. And scientists over the years have shown that there's documented declines in ice cover in the northern hemisphere. So we're seeing shorter durations of ice cover. So ice is going off earlier in the spring and it's forming later in the fall or winter. So we're getting a shorter duration of ice cover, and this has been associated with warming winters, kind of a warming climate. We're seeing these changes over time. And we can kind of see that on this figure here on the right. This paper by John Magnuson and others was really one of the first ones that got scientists to start thinking about this topic more. So these are a series of lakes. We've got time series on the x-axis from about 1845 to 1995. And this is set up a little different. So up at the top part of the graph are the freeze dates for different lakes. And so what we can see is that the freeze dates are occurring later in the winter than they used to. And then on the bottom part of the graph are the breakup dates. So when the ice comes off in the springtime. And we see that that's in general trending toward occurring earlier. And so, like I said, this was one of the first papers where scientists really started to explore these trends. And so this time series ends about 1995, and we're seeing continued changes in ice cover duration as we extend the time series out further. And then just to show kind of visually on the left-hand side here, how this graph just shows lake abundance on the x-axis and latitude on the y, and the kind of purplish blue colored parts of the graph are lakes that have seasonal ice cover, and then the grayer tones are ones that don't have seasonal ice cover. So we can see, again, that a lot of the lakes worldwide have some level of seasonal ice cover. This is a paper that was done a few years ago by Sapna Sharma and others that looked at kind of what are the current ice conditions, seasonal ice cover conditions around the world, and then how might these change under different warming scenarios. And so what we can see in this image here, this map, the kind of bluish gray parts are where we have lakes. If you had a lake in this area, you'd have a lake that would reliably freeze every winter, whereas those shaded areas with orange, they no longer are reliably freezing every winter. And so these are the kind of current conditions, but I'm going to push play here in a second, and it's going to show different warming scenarios where the word current conditions are. And then you're going to notice that the orange is shifting northward. So as we get warmer climate, predictions are that the boundary for having unreliable ice basically every winter is going to shift northward. So let me push play. So we can see as we increase from 2 to 8 Celsius, we get a lot more of this orange occurring over this time span. And so this has the potential to affect great areas of the world. And we can also, think about it in terms of how many countries stand to be affected, how many people might be affected as we lose this ice cover as the boundary shifts northward. So right now, about 15,000 lakes along the southern limit already have intermittent ice years, meaning that the ice might form and then break up within the same year. So form, break up, form again, potentially within the same winter. And based on some of these scenarios, there could be as many as 50 countries that are going to lose this ice cover, up to 230,000 lakes. And then kind of one important thing for what I'm talking about is this has the potential to affect a lot of people. So up to, say, 650 million people could be impacted if temperatures continue to rise and we lose more ice cover. So that's really what I want to spend the bulk of the rest of my time on, is thinking about some of the major cultural ecosystem services provided by seasonal ice cover. And then I also have a couple examples looking at this from more of a quantitative angle. And so first, I just want to define what cultural ecosystem services are. And then I'm going to go through some examples of some of those that are provided by seasonal ice cover. So kind of simply put, cultural ecosystem services can just be defined by services that an ecosystem provides that offer some sort of non-material or intangible benefit. So in this case, the ecosystem we're talking about is a seasonally ice-covered lake, or it could be river, but I focus more on lakes. And so I'm gonna kind of talk about the wide variety of cultural ecosystem services that these ice-covered systems can provide to people. So this is part of a project that I worked on several others with a few years ago, where we kind of had two parts, where we summarized what are some of these cultural ecosystem services, and then, like I said, looked at some quantitative examples to explore how changing ice conditions might be affecting the ways people interact with the lake, with these ice-covered lakes. And so this little diagram here on the right, we kind of broke down these cultural ecosystem services into different categories. And then within that, there are lots of different types of examples. So some of the ones I'm going to focus on today, just go through a few examples, are some of the spiritual services that can be provided, things like educational values, inspiration and aesthetics, as well as recreation, which is probably what came to mind to most of you initially when I started talking about cultural ecosystem services and lake ice. We often associate it with recreation. And then some of the others are, I'm not going to go into in so much specifics, but things like sense of place, cultural identity, and social connections are kind of all embedded within these services that this lake ice can provide. I think, well, I know when I lived in Minnesota, right, and the folks that grew up there and have lived there for a long time, winter as a season is really part of your cultural identity. The ice-covered landscapes can really provide a sense of place. So all of these, I think, for folks in these northern climates are things that you kind of can tell by instinct, right? Because you've been surrounded by these environments for so long. So I just want to go over a few examples here for some of these major categories. So the first one are the spiritual services that can be provided by lake ice. And some of these are perhaps new to folks. This is an example with the Russian Orthodox religion, where ice-covered waters are used for epiphany ceremonies. So basically, worshipers believe that all water becomes holy during epiphany. And so some folks also think, that this freezing water can provide beneficial health effects in addition. And so there's quite a lot of folks that then kind of submerge themselves in these really cold waters, oftentimes associated with an ice-covered lake or river. So this is just one of many examples that are out there across the world. Another one is with the Shinto religion in Japan. There's also some ceremonies associated with the presence of ice cover and when ice ridge an ice ridge forms on a particular lake. Educational values are another important area of cultural ecosystem services. So here on the right, it's a photo I took on Lake Itasca, where ice harvesting was being demonstrated, the kind of historical way that folks used to harvest ice, kind of providing the education of that over time, as well as looking on the left-hand side here, we've got some younger folks learning to ice fish or learning to ice skate. So of course, those educational components being translated for younger audiences and teaching them how to use these ice-covered landscapes. Some other examples are more related for the educational values with citizen science activities. So I imagine a lot of you, or at least some of you, are familiar with this example on the right-hand side. So this is an effort by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and Department of Natural Resources that's been going on for quite some time, where ice information is recorded by citizen science observers. A lot of times people that live along lakes are part of this. So they keep track of when the ice is completely covering the lake in the winter, record that date, and also when ice is completely gone from the lake in the spring, and record that and submit it to the PCA or DNR. And so they provide this really cool map every year that shows basically the time frame of when ice is going on and off the lake. So there's a really nice long-term data set for quite a few of these lakes over time that can be used for any number of reasons, including scientific purposes. And similarly in Canada, there's something called Rink Watch, which has a somewhat similar setup, looking at the long-term impacts of climate change, with citizen scientists helping to submit data for Canadian systems. And some other examples, the inspiration and aesthetics. I think just naturally, we probably all can think of images in our head of works of art that have some inspiration by these kind of ice-covered landscapes. And these are just a couple examples here with Ansel Adams on the left. But if we kind of go to more current day, or photos that you and I might take versus being a professional artist. So this is from Instagram, looking at some different hashtags that might indicate that somebody's posting about a frozen lake landscape. And so we can see, frozen lake is a hashtag. This was from a couple years ago. There were 400,000 posts. So clearly people derive a lot of pleasure, get a lot of benefits aesthetically from these kinds of landscapes. I mean, I know when I lived in Minnesota, I probably have hundreds of pictures of these types of landscapes on my phone. So we clearly derive benefits from these systems that way as well. And then finally, the last example I want to go over before I get into the quantitative end of things is recreation. And so again, this is one that I think people think about a lot. So ice fishing, that's very common and important in Minnesota. Ice hockey or ice skating can also be quite common throughout Minnesota or other northern states in the US. And I just want to point out here some more kind of unique ones that you've maybe never heard of. And I think it just goes to show you how creative people are in the wintertime, where you have these long durations of cold periods, like the interesting things people come up with to do on these landscapes. So here in the upper left is a marathon on Lake Baikal in Russia that is completely held on the lake. So that's kind of I can't imagine doing that. I think I would definitely fall down, aside from not being able to run that far. A couple other examples here Ice yachting, ice boating, ice sailing, all those kind of fall under the same category, just different names, depending on conditions. That can be an activity folks do on lake ice. This is an example of FDR and his ice yacht on the Hudson River. And another kind of interesting one is this horse race on a lake in Switzerland that's been ongoing since 1907. And so this is, again, the horse race is completely held on this ice-covered lake. And then also there's lots of like festivals or events that are either held on the shores of a lake or on the lake, or using the ice from the lake to build, say, ice castles or palaces. So again, folks are incredibly creative and use and recreate on lake ice in any number of ways. And so with that, I want to switch to some kind of data examples and the second part of what we explored in that paper. And so in general, when you're thinking about cultural ecosystem services, and especially with this lake ice question, it's really not very common to have long-term observations or data to work with. So we have really good records on ice cover for a lot of lakes. And some of these data sets can extend hundreds of years. But when we go to look at like ice fishing instead, that can be a lot more complicated. And so we took a couple strategies for this paper because we often didn't have long-term data sets. So for example, for the two examples I'm going to talk about today, ice skating and ice fishing, we compared warmer versus colder or cooler winters to look at the potential impact, as opposed to having a really long time series to look at. In the paper, we did have one long-term time series from that lake in Japan that I mentioned, but I'm not going to talk about that more today just for the sake of time. All right, so in terms of ice fishing, I think we're probably all pretty aware how important it can be for these northern states culturally and economically. In certain areas, it can provide subsistence. Of course, it's really important for recreation as well as providing cultural identity to folks. And just to give you kind of a sense of some dollar amounts here associated with ice fishing, this is a somewhat outdated study from 2011, or a survey that showed that in this time period, about $178 million was spent on ice fishing equipment throughout the US. And they estimated there were about 2 million ice fishing anglers every year, representing about 38 million days. So there's a lot of ice fishing going on. But again, like I said, there haven't been a lot of studies really looking at changes in ice cover with ice fishing, largely because it's a difficult data set to get together. And so what we did, we looked specifically in Minnesota and looked at ice fishing tournaments. And so ice fishing tournaments in the state are pretty popular. So depending on the year, there can be up to 100 tournaments per year, with as many as 60,000 people participating. And so we took advantage of the fact that to have an ice fishing tournament, you have to have a permit through the DNR. We took advantage of that fact to gather some permit data from 2005 to 2017. So again, not a very long time series, but we do have variability in the winter temperatures during this time period. And this is a photo I took from the Park Rapids Fishing Derby in 2019. And so what we did is we basically broke the state up into 9 different regions based kind of on climate regions. And we broke it up further into a northern region, central region, and then southern. Kind of, you can see that depicted on the map there. And for this talk and for the the paper, we really only focused on the northern and central regions because there weren't very many fishing tournaments in the southern region. And so what we did is we basically looked at the tournaments in these different regions and compared it with the winter air temperatures from November to January, because that really kind of sets the stage for the conditions for when most of these tournaments happen in January and February. And so I have a few graphs here. The left-hand side is northern Minnesota, and then the right-hand side is central Minnesota. And the top graphs are just showing how many tournaments, with the bar graphs, how many tournaments were held each year. And then the gray shading within the bar graphs are the number that were canceled each year. And then the dotted lines are just how many participants were expected at those tournaments. So these weren't necessarily how many were there, but how many the organizers were expecting to have attend. And so I mainly just wanted to show this to show how there are quite a few tournaments every year, particularly in central Minnesota, where there's anywhere from 40 to 60 tournaments. And then even in northern Minnesota, you get around 20 to 30 tournaments each year. And then, of course, with there being more tournaments in the central part of the state, you've got a larger number of people that are expected to go. But what we were mostly interested in was how did the temperature affect whether or not you were likely to have a successful event. So were there more cancellations of tournaments in warmer winters, basically? And so what I have plotted here on the bottom is just the average winter air temperature and the percentage of canceled tournaments. And so in the northern part of the state, we saw no relationship between the two. Whereas in central Minnesota, we saw that as you had warmer winter air temperatures, we saw an increase in the percentage of canceled tournaments, especially as you got to about -5 Celsius or warmer. So that's where those red arrows indicate. And I put the arrow on the northern part too, just to note that it really never got that warm there during these years. So we didn't really see, right? We didn't see those cancellations happening in the same way. And I also want to mention that with the northern part of the state, some of these cancellations were because it was too cold. So the organizers decided to cancel because it was, say, like -30 that day or something. So only in some cases did the data set provide reasons for cancellations. But I do know some of those were because it was just too cold. All right, and I just want to spend a brief amount of time giving an example for ice skating and some data that we compiled, and looking at this question in a similar way to the ice fishing tournament. So outdoor ice skating has also been incredibly important for a long time, both for recreation, and also it used to be used more as a mode of transportation. And there's been a few studies that have kind of looked at ice skating and how winter conditions are affecting ice skating over time. So this was a study from a popular canal for ice skating in Ottawa, Canada, where they basically predicted that with increased air temperatures, the number of skating days is going to go down substantially, and the length of the ice skating season is going to decrease by quite a bit. And then there's been another study somewhat similar to that one for some canals in the Netherlands. And so what I have here is an example where we looked at an ice skating competition. And so we were looking at this competition in Sweden, but I first have to describe a little bit about this competition that occurs in the Netherlands, because they're connected. So there's this really popular Dutch ice skating race in the Netherlands called the 11 Cities Tour. So it started in 1909, and it's a competition that occurs only when the waters are frozen and safe. And it's incredibly popular. So they can have up to 15,000 participants, but the last one was held in 1997. And so there's only been about 15 held in total. And just to kind of indicate how popular this is, some Olympic ice skaters, Dutch ice skaters, have said they would skip the Olympics if they had the opportunity to participate in this 11 Cities Tour. So kind of a alternative venue was created to try to offer another place to do something along this line in Sweden called the Viking Ride. So this was developed in 1999 with the thought that it would be a more reliable venue. So this Viking Ride was basically a route from one city, so Uppsala, to Stockholm. And so it ran from 1999 to 2017, but unfortunately, this lake also started to experience unpredictable ice. So now it's kind of in this period of indefinite cancellation. So they are no longer holding it on this lake anymore either. But what we wanted to look at was could we quantitatively see the relationship between these warmer winters and the ice skating competitions for this Viking ride. And so we took the data from these competitions and put them into 3 different categories. So we had a track category, a loop category, and then none. So the track meant that the competition was held as they planned. So there was the direct route going from one city to the other, so Uppsala to Stockholm. And then there was the loop category where they had to alter the route and have multiple laps with the same start and end location because somewhere along that typical direct route, there were unsafe conditions. So the loop's kind of in the middle. And then none, meaning the race was canceled. And we took a similar approach where we looked at the average winter air temperatures and compared it to see if there was a relationship between what type of route occurred that year. And so what we found here, so again, we've got track, so that's the normal route. Loop, there were some unsafe conditions, and then none, no competition occurred. We see that in years where we had the normal route, so the track, they were on average much colder than when there was a modified route or a canceled route. And so the little text values here in red indicate the average temperatures when the track was held the normal route, so about 25 Fahrenheit versus up to 30 to 31 Fahrenheit when there was either a modification or a cancellation. So again, we see this relationship between these warming conditions and these impacts to recreation in a negative way where like those tournaments were canceled with ice fishing, or these competitions for ice skating had to be canceled or modified substantially. So to kind of wrap these empirical examples up and just kind of the cultural ecosystem services as a whole. So this is something, a topic that is gaining more and more attention over time because I think people are starting to notice changes in ice cover over time. They're noticing things that perhaps they used to do a long time ago is getting more difficult. And so this is gaining a lot of traction in the popular press. Some of these headlines here are based on the work that I just talked about, some interviews that we gave. Some of these others are just examples that you find out like in the National Geographic about journalists starting to explore this topic more over time. And one really important thing that I haven't touched on much is that aside from people being affected and, their sense of place or their ability to go recreate changing, there's also going to be, there stands to be economic impacts as well, but we really don't have a good handle on those. Although some people are really starting to think about this more and more, the folks that kind of combined ecology or environmental science with economic impacts and assessing those. So there's more attention that's being focused on this here in more recent years. And so this also is something that you read a lot about in the newspapers that journalists are starting to cover because there are these really important dollars that come in during the winter time, right? So all these lake areas have a lot of recreation during the summer. You've got boating and all the activities you can have in the summertime, but in the winter, they rely on this ice or the snow, for snowmobiling to be able to bring in some dollars. So this is an area that deserves some more attention. And then just really quickly, I wanted to mention an example with regard to kind of dollar amounts and economic impacts. Another thing that lakes, frozen water bodies and lakes, rivers can be used for are ice roads. And so in Canada and parts of Canada, ice road networks are incredibly important for connecting Indigenous communities with access to medicine and food. So these remote areas can really rely on ice roads. And so in Ontario, they invest in about 3,000 kilometers every winter in building and maintaining them. And so they've seen the cost go up over time from about 3 million to 5.8 million in more recent years. But that being said, it's still a lot cheaper to work with these winter roads than to build permanent roads, right? So to have winter road construction cost about $1,300 per kilometer versus $500,000 or more per kilometer to build a winter road. So if these winter roads are no longer capable of being utilized, there's going to be a lot of investments in building more permanent road solutions. And then another kind of emerging area that I'm not going to get time to talk about, but an active area of research by myself and others is really understanding winter lake ecology. So lakes were historically not studied much in the wintertime by lake scientists, but we're finding more and more that they're a lot more biologically active than we anticipated in the past. And in fact, you can even have algal blooms that occur in the wintertime, even blooms like cyanobacteria, which are the ones we often hear about in the summer. And so there's a lot that can be going on in the winter in the lakes, including lots of algal activity. And we're also starting to find that winter conditions might set the stage for the summer, though there's still a lot more that we need to learn because we have pretty limited data so far. And of course, like a lot of lake science or ecology in general, we find some different patterns. So we have a lot more to study to find some kind of more general patterns about, for example, how winter might set the stage for the summer. So this is a really emerging area of lake science that we need to learn a lot more about, especially as we're seeing these changing winter conditions occur quite rapidly in some areas. So that's one area that I feel like is a really important future direction, learning about how lakes function in the winter, as well as looking at those economic impacts, right? Quantifying those in more detail and thinking a bit more about adaptation. So how do we potentially find alternatives to those winter activities that we relied upon, like ice skating or something? Perhaps we have to shift to indoor ice skating, but of course that can come with cost. it's expensive to build an ice skating rink. It may limit participation. If you now have to pay to get into an ice skating rink instead of before you could just go onto a public lake system to go ice skating. So again, these are all things that I think are going to be kind of future directions as we think about ice cover into the future. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions folks have. And again, another image here. This is my husband dragging our little pop-up tent on Lake Itasca.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Knoll. Now let's go to the Q&A portion of today's program. It'll be hosted by Bill Granches. Bill?
Thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our question and answer session for today's program. Now, remember, we are not using the chat function. So if you have a question, please use the question and answer button you see down there at the bottom of your screen. Now, we may combine similar questions together, and if we don't get to your question, feel free to send us an email. I'm going to read the questions out loud, and then they'll be answered by Dr. Knoll. Okay, Dr. Knoll, actually, it's interesting. We're having a lot of people commenting about experiences they had in their lifetime with ice. But as an example, here's one from Karen. Just a comment. The practice of cold plunging, sitting in a tub of ice for 3 to 6 minutes, has become very popular recently due to the so-called health benefits. Oof. Anyway,
yeah, no, it is true though. It's even since the paper got published, that wasn't such a thing you heard about. It's really in the last few years, the last couple of years, that you're hearing a lot about the benefits of ice plunging and people buying ice baths and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Wow. Bad enough for me to think about doing polar plunge for Special Olympics, but yeah. Okay, here's a question for you. Are shallower lakes more at danger for thin ice with threats to snowmobiling and ice fishing?
Well, I think it's kind of just ice in general, like you really need to know your local. So another paper that I worked on that I didn't talk about was looking at how drownings in the winter have changed over time and how those are associated with different winter temperatures basically and different parts of the year. And so in that we found that it's really those shoulder seasons where you're getting, we found an increased incidence of drowning in the winter. So by shoulder seasons, I mean like the springtime and the fall. So as ice is setting up and going down. So I think that's one thing you really have to take into account, whether you're talking about a shallow or a deeper lake. And then also, I think knowing that system really well, because you can have different springs that might make certain areas along the shore more susceptible to thin spots versus others. So I think those things are really important to think about with regard to lake ice, and especially as you're considering getting out there on a snowmobile or otherwise. Yeah.
This made me think, is there a correlation between the depth of water and the thickness of ice? In other words, would a deeper lake have same conditions, more ice, the same ice, or less ice than a shallow lake?
Same exact conditions.
Yeah. To me, it would seem it'd be the same. But
yeah, I mean, a lot of times on deeper lakes, it takes longer for the ice to form, right? It sets, like Elk Lake took way longer than Lake Itasca at Itasca State Park, but then it also took longer for it to go off. But there might be some others on the call that could answer that question better than me. If you had the exact same conditions But yeah, they definitely set up at different times
Right.
when
Okay.
the ice goes on. Yeah.
Well, we have a comment here from Tom that said, when we first had our cabin on Thorpe Road overlooking Deer Lake in Itasca County, the ice would go about the middle of May. While I haven't been there for many years, I seem to recall that sometime mid-April the ice goes out. That's almost a month earlier, much of which has been increasing over the past 30 years. Yeah, we've seen that too. Okay, so as far as the question, next question. Peter asks, how might the ice changes affect fish size, quantity, and other characteristics?
So there are people, wait, so how much might the lake ice, just lake ice in general? The question.
How might ice changes,
Ice changes.
you're right, affect the size,
At the
quantity, or other
size.
characteristics?
I think I know there are people that I don't personally work on fish ecology that often, or especially not with this question. There are some folks that are starting to look at how changing winter conditions can affect fish dynamics, although I'm more familiar with how it affects like their thermal habitat. And so I think it would depend on the species you're talking about, like an organism that needs colder temperatures for overall it likes colder temperatures during the year. Increasing water temperatures, which could go hand in hand with it, changes on ice cover, could affect that fish species more than, like, say you've got like your bluegill or something, right, that do better in warmer temperatures. So I think it would kind of depend on the fish that you're talking about, whether or not it could hurt them or harm them. Yeah. But then, yeah, there's lots of folks that are starting to think about that in a little more detail.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Ed asks, do lakes heal or become cleaner? Invasive plant species dying, for example, during the winter.
So it depends on the, I'm going to just keep saying it depends, but for the invasive, if it depends on what its kind of thermal tolerance is. So if it's invaded from somewhere that doesn't get quite as cold as Minnesota, then absolutely that could help with invasives. But I think the invasives we think about in Minnesota for lakes, they typically do just fine in the winter. So
yeah, they're just dormant, right?
Yeah,
right.
but
we see that every year.
Yeah, but lakes do kind of reset to some degree in the wintertime, right? Because even though I said lakes are more biologically active than we thought they were in the wintertime, they're still not as biologically active. Like, right, there's in most lakes, there's not as much algae in the winter as there is in the summer. Now, there's some caveats to that. There are some lakes that are equally as there would be equally as much algae or plant production, but in general there's not. So it kind of in that way like resets, similar to a forest, right, where you have the trees go down or the leaves go down. So yeah.
Very good. Joseph asks, do you know if NOAA is doing any algal bloom studies? They do a lot for our ocean coasts.
Yeah, there are. Yeah, NOAA does have some active algae studies, especially thinking about like the cyanobacteria blooms. So I don't know of any specific that are occurring. I can't think of any specific examples, but I know for sure that there's lots of resources devoted to especially the cyanobacteria blooms, because they can harm the systems themselves as well as people. So yeah.
Let me see. Well, here's a medical question for you. Well, sort of. John asks, are medical costs involved if ice is thinner or later? I am wondering about increased hypothermia due to breaking through the ice, also possible equipment loss.
Yeah, so that's similar. That kind of ties in with that other study I mentioned I was part of. So yeah, we did find we had data from 10 countries where we were able to get basically like the death records
Mhm.
across these 10 countries. And we were focused on mortalities, but that was, clearly because of hypothermia or other kind of shocks to the system for when people fell through the ice. So I would expect that there would be, in general, increased medical costs, right, associated if more people are falling through the ice.
Mhm.
And then the rescues involved, right? There's
Sure.
the expense and the danger of that, as well as I didn't grow up in Minnesota, so I learned an awful lot about uh, lake ice and different things in the wintertime, like the towing companies that exist just to get the trucks or UTVs or snowmobiles out of the ice as they punch through. So all of that cost would go up as well. Yeah.
Very true. Okay, next question. Is anyone studying the impact on local businesses of shortened snowmobile seasons, since snowmobiles are often use frozen lakes and trail conditions, is likely affected by the climate change?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there are some people doing that. And I don't know about in Minnesota specifically, but I did run across that some people are looking at that. And actually, the one area of kind of recreation and wintertime activities that has the most amount of studies done from a more academic or quantitative perspective is with skiing.
Mm,
And I think that's right because of all the skiing industry is so big, right? There's a lot of money associated with like going to a ski lodge or a ski
sure,
slope. So there's been quite a lot of studies looking at that from an
sure.
economic standpoint. And I do believe, I think there is a group of scientists out of the University of Minnesota that might be looking at the economic impact of warmer winters across the state of Minnesota. So I think there are some folks working on that right now that kind of just started when I was leaving
Mm,
the university. So I would expect, if I'm right about that, that there'll be some. You'll all be hearing about it soon. There'll
sure.
be some studies that come out and will make press in the newspapers and radio stations.
I'm always reading about the economic costs of change, and
Yeah,
I don't see how this could be any different.
yeah.
Okay, here's a question for you. Actually, yeah, this is my question. Uh, does less ice in the winter contribute to warmer water temperatures during the rest of the year? I'm thinking of the insulating properties of ice in that.
Yeah, it could. It it could. It also could. One thing that people have shown more, I think, is like how when in the summertime, if you're somebody that goes fishing, you might hear something called like the thermocline,
Mhm.
where the temperature shifts, right? It's warm at the top of the lake and it gets the thermoclines where it's changing temperature kind of rapidly. And then you've got the bottom waters that are cooler. So the top layer of the lake and the bottom layer of the lake are they're stratified, they're separated from each other. And so what some folks have found is that with the shorter duration of ice cover, we can have a longer period of stratification during the year, as opposed to like longer times in the winter that you have kind of more mixed conditions. So, or in the spring before the stratification sets up. So that
Mhm.
has implications for oxygen dynamics in the lake, which then could
Sure.
extend to things like your cold water fish habitat if you lose kind of suitable habitat areas deeper in the lake where you have
I
enough
see.
oxygen and cold temperatures.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Do we know how Native Americans view these trends? For example, does this trend affect wild rice production?
I don't know if I don't know if it affects wild rice production, but in terms of, I did, when we were working on that paper, I did find, some examples in Alaska where, some, communities that rely on, ice covered landscapes for hunting routes, for example, were noticing these trends. These were more like sociological studies, so kind of sociology or anthropology researchers doing interviews with people. And so, yeah, folks have definitely noticed this, and similarly in some of the Nordic countries, there's also been folks that have been looking at that with regard to like caribou hunting and being able to kind of access their traditional hunting grounds for accessing across like these frozen landscapes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, I don't know about the wild rice, so sorry about that.
No, I don't know either. Actually here, Chris G has a comment. This goes back to something we're talking about later. Deeper water lakes can hold more heat energy, part of why ice takes longer to form there. The same should make deep water lakes have thinner ice. Interesting. Thank you for that, Chris. Okay. Next question. Is there any work being done to produce maps of ice in dates similar to the ice out date maps?
Yeah. I mean, oh, for the state of Minnesota, you think the one I showed? Yeah. So
yeah,
if this question is about the PCA and DNR map, you can get either of those right now. Yeah. So it's really cool. You can look at past years. It's a really nice website. I encourage you to check it out. So you can look at lake ice in and ice off, but they do have a delay built in there for ice on, I believe, because of safety issues. So they don't do it immediately. They don't want people to go out on unsafe conditions. So they do have kind of a time lag on that.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time. Actually, we don't have much time, but one last question. If people don't spend money on ice fishing, do they just spend it in some other activity? Is it lost revenue or just a shift in activities?
I think that's an interesting question. I think the economist would have to look into that, but I have thought about it some. And yeah, I think they could just invest in new activities. I also think though, like, sometimes people have said, well, won't people just go open water fishing longer? And I don't think that's necessarily a yes right now, because right when it's like really cold, but there's no ice on the water, people might not want to go out on their boat in those conditions. And I also think too that I barely brought it up, but these alternative activities that you could potentially do sometimes come with cost associated, so it could limit the participation by people. Like the example actually ice fishing is a good example. Maybe you just need like a fishing pole and you walk out on the ice and you've got your auger and you're good to go. But so that in a way is a lot cheaper than in the summer to go fishing. You need a boat, you need more equipment basically. So there could be some losses in that regard in terms of who can participate.
Okay. Well, I see we're almost out of time here. Dr. Knoll, thank you so much for those answers to those questions. I'm going to turn this back over to Brian. Brian, back to you.
All right. Thanks, Bill. And a big thank you to Dr. Knoll for that great information. This is the last Water Wisdom program for 2023, so I'd like to take a quick moment to say a few quick things. During the past 2 years of presenting the Itasca Water's Water Wisdom programs, the guy in the background, making it all work, is a fellow by the name of Chad Maneke. And Chad is an interesting guy. He served in the U.S. Air Force for 22 years, starting as an information officer and working his way up to administrative superintendent in charge of 1,500 personnel. Since 2018, he's worked with Director John Downing at Minnesota Sea Grant, and this past Monday, Chad started his new job at the U of M Centralized Financial Operations Center. Itasca Waters is deeply grateful to Chad for volunteering to make all the water wisdom programs run smoothly. So thank you, Mr. Manicky, for all that you have done for us. We wish you good fortune in your new post. And over the last 2 years, a gang of Itasca Waters board members and volunteers have given their time and intelligence to the Water Wisdom series. We want to single out just 2 who have led the way. Dr. John Downing, director of the Sea Grant program, has used his considerable influence to book the best guests for us. And thank you, John, you did well. Lastly, I want to give a huge Zoom hug to Shirley Leggering, a longtime Itasca Waters board member and just a joy to know. Shirley has headed up the committee that created and produced the Water Wisdom series, and that job has required considerable skills of leadership, inspiration, detail management, and kindness. Shirley has all those skills and many more. As the old Western saying goes, she's a good one to ride the river with. So thanks, Shirley. You're simply the best. If you would like to watch this program again or recommend it to your friends and neighbors, a recording of today's talk will soon be on our website at itascawaters.org, along with all the previous programs. We would love to get your feedback, so click on the survey link, which will be on the screen at the end of today's program, which is now. You will also be getting an email evaluation form from Itasca Waters, so you can choose how you'd like to respond. We appreciate hearing from you. I'm Brian Whittemore, and thanks for being with us today.